The pulpit in the 18th century was an influential means of disseminating information and ideas to the colonies. Many of these themes that were preached at this time revolved around the idea of protecting the civil and religious liberties of the people and their patriotic duty to fight against those who would abolish those liberties. When conflict began in the colonies, many of the clergy believed it was their patriotic duty to join in the fight for their freedoms and took on the role of chaplain. In the role of chaplain, the clergy continued to promote the idea of patriotic duty while ministering to the soldiers of the Continental Army. For many towns, the only local public meeting place was a church. From the pulpit, announcements and proclamations were made, and in some churches the minister would give lectures during the week. The colonists looked to the clergy for enlightenment, approval, and guidance, and many expected the clergy to take a role in the struggle for freedom. The clergy were not only influential in their congregations, but also throughout the colonies. It was a common practice to have a sermon at the election of new government officials and at the annual Ancient and Honorable Artillery election in Boston. Many of these sermons were put into pamphlet form and then distributed throughout the 13 colonies. These sermons were written in the devout belief that religion and law were closely connected. Many of these sermons spoke on the natural rights of man, qualities that make a good soldier, the justification of war, and that military service is commendable and legitimate for a churchgoer. The clergy also proclaimed heaven's blessings on them and their posterity for their endeavors and sacrifices. The election sermons shaped the thinking of people for generations. It is no wonder that when conflict broke out, that many of these churchgoers were ready to fight against Britain, and many were not surprised to see ministers serve as chaplains, since they had proclaimed it a religious duty to fight against Britain. Many years after the American Revolution, Judge Mellon Chamberlain interviewed Captain Levi Preston, a Revolutionary War soldier, to gain an understanding of why a man would leave home and fight, risking death or loss of limb against the world's strongest empire. Judge Chamberlain came to the conclusion that their religious liberties were indissolubly connected with their civil liberties, and therefore that it was a religious duty to risk aggressions on their civil rights, that a man could not be a good Christian who was not a true patriot. When Washington took command of Boston on July 3, 1775, there were already 15 chaplains serving in the militia. The earliest legislation known to recognize the chaplaincy was issued in Congress on July 29, 1775, when they set the pay of chaplain at $20 a month. July 29th is the official birthday of the United States Army Chaplain Corps. A chaplain usually was chosen by the regiment's commander. It was not uncommon for the chaplain to be a friend or acquaintance of the commander and the soldiers in the regiment. Many times the regiment was made up of men who were part of the chaplain's congregation. This meant that there were bonds of friendship already established, along with mutual trust and esteem among the soldiers and the chaplain. This bond was only strengthened because of the nature of war. Many of the chaplains who were appointed were vocal about their patriotism. The British disliked those chaplains who had influence and treated them poorly. In a letter to John Beatty on April 4, 1780, Washington discusses the agreement with the British that any chaplain who is taken prisoner of war should be released immediately. This did not always happen, as in the case of Chaplain Moses Allen, an outspoken supporter of the Patriot cause. Allen's house and church were burned down by local Tories, and at the Battle of Savannah he was taken prisoner and placed on a prison ship. Allen attempted to escape by swimming to shore, but was too weak and drowned. Another tragic tale involves Chaplain John Rosbrugh, who joined the chaplaincy at the age of 63. Chaplain Rosbrugh was with Washington in the Battle of Trenton and somehow lingered behind the Continental Army and was captured by a British officer and a band of Hessians. Rosbrugh offered his gold watch and money if they let him go, but they did not. Instead, they bayoneted him 17 times, took his clothes, and left him lying naked on the ground. It is said that the British officer who killed Rosbrugh went into a local house and bragged about killing a rebel person. Washington was concerned that there were not enough chaplains for the soldiers. It was his desire that there should be one chaplain to each regiment, but Congress did not agree and instead appointed one chaplain to 2 regiments. Washington was also concerned that the pay of chaplains was too low and wrote to Congress about this issue on June 28, 1776. He states that the chaplains were finding it hard to pay their replacements back home and not go into debt while only receiving $20 a month. Congress agrees to increase the pay, and Washington sends out this general order, which includes a recommendation for the type of character a chaplain should possess. The Honorable Continental Congress having been pleased to allow a chaplain to each regiment with a pay of $33 1/3 a month. The colonels or commanding officers of each regiment are directed to procure chaplains accordingly, persons of good character and exemplary lives, to see that all inferior officers and soldiers pay them a suitable respect and attend carefully upon religious exercises. The blessing and protection of heaven are at all times necessary, but especially so in times of public distress and danger. The general hopes and trusts that every officer and man will endeavor so to live and act as becomes a Christian soldier, defending the dearest rights and liberties of his country. The role of chaplain was to conduct divine services, prayers, and tend to the sick and dying. Congress also had plans as to what the role of chaplain should be. Congress felt the chaplain should promote religion, morals, discipline, and improve morale. They should stop the sins of cursing, swearing, and other vices. The chaplain should recommend cleanliness as a virtue of good health, and these goals would be accomplished through public and private exhortations to obey general and regimental orders. The chaplain would help improve morale by discouraging desertions, praising and recommending service, and encouraging men to enlist. Divine services were offered throughout the war, and many of these sermons focused on God's providence and respect for his name. They also focused on such themes as duty of the soldier, submission to authority, loyalty, and patriotism. The chaplains did not focus on controversial issues or the finer points of doctrine. Washington felt very strongly about swearing and cursing and gaming, and in General Order dated May 26, 1777, Washington states that vice and immorality should be discouraged, and since there is a chaplain in each regiment, soldiers should be attending divine services. Some chaplains had more than one role to fill while serving in the Army. Some of the other roles that a chaplain may have filled to be that of surgeon or soldier. Chaplain West is credited with breaking the code used by Dr. Benjamin Church, the first head of the medical department, proving that he was, in fact, on the British payroll. A chaplain was at every major conflict and in some instances led men into battle. In the famous painting of Jonathan Trumbull, The Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker Hill, one can see the image of Reverend Samuel McClintock. In this painting, he is represented by a man with the clerical collar putting a ramrod into a musket. The proceeding of the Bunker Hill Monument Association describes Chaplain McClintock in the following manner. Nor was he the kind of shepherd to send his flock into dangers that he was unwilling to share. When the order came for his regiment to proceed to Bunker Hill, he marched with them, ready to not only soothe the last moments of the dying, but also to set a manly example to the living. Chaplain McClintock had 4 sons serve in the war, but only one son made it home. Another case of a dual role of a chaplain would be that of Chaplain James Caldwell. Caldwell served as a chaplain and an assistant to the quartermaster general. Caldwell was known as a soldier parson and had earned the respect of many. At the Battle of Springfield, the Americans were running low on wadding. Caldwell ran into the nearby Presbyterian church, grabbed some hymnals, and handed them out, saying, "Give them Watts, boys, give them Watts." Caldwell communicated frequently with Washington on military activities and intelligence. This angered the British and some local Tories, and as a result his house was burned down, and in a tragic turn of events his wife was shot and killed by the British. Caldwell continued in his cause, and on November 24, 1781, he was shot by an off-duty sentry who was believed to have been bribed by the British. This was a chaplain who served in a dual role and was killed for his involvement in the war. There are many examples of the ministers who took their patriotic sense of duty to God and country. A total of 115 chaplains received commissions in the Continental Army, with the majority of chaplains serving from Connecticut and Massachusetts. These chaplains minister to the sick, the wounded, the dying, and the living. They encourage the soldiers through sermons, exhortations, and prayers. Some chaplains took on the dual role of minister and soldier in order to fight for their liberties. These are the first chaplains who taught a generation that religious and political freedom and responsibility are inseparable. This tradition continues 239 years later, in which the chaplains in the chaplain corps strive to nurture the living, care for the wounded, and honor the fallen.